Hello there, and welcome to Wrong Ways Colombia cast with me, Brendan Wrongway Corrigan. Now, if you can suspend your disbelief for a moment and imagine a world without coronavirus, in such a scenario, there would be giddy excitement here in Colombia as we geared up to co-host Copa America 2020. In fact, it will be getting underway in just over a week's time as we record this. Alas, like pretty much all sporting events, it's not taking place. We do have it to look forward to next year, at least. On the flip side for football fans, the game has made a tentative return in Europe, minus supporters albeit, yet it still seems some way off from returning to this side of the world. Needless to say, as it is in so many sectors, it's a challenging, worrying time for many clubs here. Joining us to chat about this lack of football scene here and what we can expect when it returns is Bogotá-based football writer Carl Worswick. Carl, before we get into all of that, you had a beautifully written article in The Guardian recently detailing the curious case of World Cup winning England captain Bobby Moore and the missing bracelet from a swanky Bogota hotel. For those who don't know the story, can you fill us in as to what exactly happened?
Hello. So it was 1970. For the first time, for the only time in England's history, they were world champions. And this was the World Cup in Mexico. So England flew over to Mexico and they had a couple of weeks doing some preparation there. And they decided to come to Bogota. Two reasons, really. One, because they wanted to do some altitude training. Mexico was a lot higher than that most players were used to. And also because Colombia were interested in hosting the 1986 World Cup. So to get the powerful English FA's bid on support on side was considered the way to go. So they came to Bogota and they'd only been in the country about 3 hours, and they're in the Hotel Tequendama, which was the emblematic hotel of its time. It's fallen on harder times in more recent years, but back then it was the place to be. And Bobby Charlton, the England midfielder, wandered into one of the shops that was based inside the hotel to look for a ring for his wife, and Bobby Moore, the England captain, accompanied him, and he came out, and a few minutes later the shop assistants came running out and accusing him of robbing a bracelet. And none of the players understood Spanish, and the police came over and he had to make a statement, and it was thought that was the end of the case. But England played Colombia in El Campín and won 4-0, and then they had a second friendly in Ecuador a few days later. So they flew out to Ecuador, played Ecuador, beat them 2-0, and it was a week before the World Cup, and they were about to fly to Mexico, the final stage of their preparations, but they had a stopover in Bogota. Now, they did consider changing their flight because they were still slightly worried that this case had been reopened and Bobby Moore had been called in for more questioning, but they thought that would have been suspicious. So they did make the stopover in Bogota, and as they had landed, the British Embassy did a deal with the police to prevent them marching straight on the airplane and arresting Bobby Moore, which would have been ridiculously embarrassing for everybody involved. But he was the deal was that he would go down to the police station and answer some more questions while his teammates watched an old black and white film back at the Hotel Tequendama. But as it turned out, he ended up being detained. And the judge originally was going to put him in the DAS, the secret, is it the secret police? I can't.
Yeah, I think secret police. I think
in the jail in the headquarters down in the centre. But the Football Federation president did a deal and sort of saved him. And he was one of the first ever cases of casa por cárcel, the house arrest, while they tried to sort this mess out. And as you can imagine, it was massive. It was on the front page of almost every newspaper in the world. Harold Wilson, who was the Labour Prime Minister at the time, was using all his political influences to try and get the Colombian president involved and to get him off. because it would be like Lionel Messi a week before the World Cup being arrested and accused of stealing a bracelet. And in the end,
Wow.
we still don't know. It's the 50th anniversary this year, and we still don't know the full story of what happened. And I guess that's keeps it alive, keeps it quite interesting.
Yeah, because you've done a lot of digging in this. Because you were telling me earlier that you helped the guy who wrote Bobby Moore's biography. So you have a lot of the background information. Where are your own thoughts on it? What do you think happened?
Well, it's Matt Dickinson who wrote the biography. He's the football editor of the Times, the man in full. He did even more work than I did. I mainly concentrated on the Colombian side of things, but he spoke to all the old players and his wife, his ex-wife. He did an exhaustive job in tracking everyone down and asking them. And it seems incredible that somebody so rich, somebody so famous, and he was one of the first footballers to make that step from being just an athlete to being part of the showbiz scene. So he had no need whatsoever to do this. Why would he have done it? And within 2 hours of landing in a country he'd never been to before and probably knew very little about. But there is an interesting factor in all this, because a month before that had happened, Colombia had gone to the polls, and there have been quite a few dirty elections in Colombia's history, but this is considered the worst of all, where I can't remember his name now, Rojas Pinilla, who was he was up running on a quite progressive ticket, and everybody expected him to be winning. On the night that they were going to announce the election results, all communication was severed, and the country woke up the next day, and he'd lost, and it was the Conservative Party guy who'd been elected. So it's in this context that Bobby Moore arrived in the centre of Bogotá. And do I think he's guilty? No, I don't. Even though I've never met the guy, because he died in 1993. But there is enough doubts to suggest that something did happen, that there's something we haven't been told, something we haven't found out from it all. A lot of this comes from Jeff Powell, who is a Daily Mail journalist who comes from the east end of London, same as Bobby Moore. And apparently and they were really good friends. And apparently before he died, he told Bobby Moore that something had happened, that it might have been a prank, that one of the younger players might have done something stupid. And if you can imagine, there wasn't the media glare like there is today. It wasn't so staged. There wasn't a person specially designated in the squad to look after the media and to protect the players. It wasn't like that. So pranks were a common feature of these trips abroad, and a lot of them were in their early 20s, and they all played in England. There wasn't really much European football, so this was a bit like a lad's holiday, really. But out of respect for Bobby and this sort of mythical East End code, he said that the secret would remain with Bobby Moore. It would go to the grave with him. And there have been other murmurs that maybe this he took the flak. He covered for one of the younger players. So, but I doubt we'll ever find out, because I spent about 2 years trying to find the government file, and as you can imagine, I got sent from one notary office to the other, to the Fiscalia, down to the warehouses in the south of the city, and I couldn't find it.
Another thing that you mentioned in the recent Guardian article is that he might have been, Bobby Moore and the team, kind of victims of a bit of a swindle. A few crafty Colombians, I might get into trouble for saying that, but that also might seem more of a possibility, that these employees who perhaps weren't making that much money in their work thought, we've got an opportunity here to kind of plant something on these famous footballers. That seems another likely
that's
scenario.
The most plausible thing. That's the most likely explanation of it. And actually, Pele had come to Colombia 1968, a couple of years beforehand, and something similar had happened to him. and certainly the owner of the shop, he paid off a local street seller for him to come forward as a second witness. And so, yes, something didn't really add up there. And there certainly is an element of truth in that. But it backfired massively because his shop was closed down. The Hotel Tekindam, as I said, was probably the most famous hotel in the entire country. Kicked them out. The girl probably had to change her name and leave the country. And the lawyer for the shop, who refused to speak to me 50 years on, was quite upset at me calling him. He has a very interesting career after that, because he becomes the lawyer for the Grupo Santo Domingo, one of the biggest companies in Colombia, but he's also an M19 military activist, and he actually stood for them when they put down their arms. So he somehow balances these two careers. But I think there is. It's not that black and white that it was just a stitch up, but there is an element of that.
I do find it crazy that the lawyer didn't want to speak about it, and was actually quite upset that you contacted him, because he's about the only kind of direct surviving member, is he now?
Absolutely. In Colombia, nearly everyone has died, and there aren't that many England players left either. So, I couldn't believe that at 50 years on, he told me never to call him again and hung up. It still hurts, still smart.
Yeah, you won't be meeting him up for a coffee anyway in the next couple of weeks during this.
Weirdly, the guy who gave me the contact for him advised me, right, what you need to do, you need to go to this coffee shop, and he told me where it was, and ask for, but that's not his real name. And I'm thinking, what is the mystery? 50 years on, just to meet this guy. Why is there still so much? Is this shrouded in mystery? But we'll never know. Yeah. We'll never know.
I mean, it wasn't the most expensive of bracelets either, was it?
Well, I think for the time it was.
Okay.
I think, what was it, 25,000 pesos. But then the shop owner, I don't. This is a part of legalese I'm not too familiar with. But when he pressed charges, he upped that to about 205 or 210,000 pesos because damages to his moral character or something like that. So I think it would have been a sizable fee, especially for here in Colombia. I mean, Bobby Moore, as Sir Alf Ramsey, the England manager, quipped. Bobby Moore could afford to have bought the whole hotel. So, why would he have stolen the payslip? But still, for Colombia terms, I think it would have been seen as... I wouldn't like to put a figure on it, but we're talking probably tens of millions of pesos.
Okay. But one thing as well that comes across in the article that you wrote, Bobby Moore seems like a real gentleman in terms of his conduct in all of this, and then he went on to Mexico and performed gallantly for the England team as well at the World Cup in Mexico. So he comes across, I mean, a guy who I don't know much about, I have to say, but he comes across as a real kind of hero almost in this.
Yes, perhaps. Maybe that was my English tribute to our only World Cup winning captain. But he just recovered from, a few years after he'd had cancer. But he was a massive boozer as well. And I don't know if he made the final cut, but in the article, when he was under house arrest, he drained the entire Football Federation president's house of booze. And then was up at 6 o'clock the next morning to go for a jog while his armed guards, who were meant to be watching over him, continued to nurse their hangovers and sleep in. But no, he had this incredible inner strength to not let it affect him. He always thought he'd get through it somehow. He must have been deep down worried, because when he was released, it was 4 days before England's first game, and he hadn't been training. And the psychological effect must have been massive too. But from all records, from all conversations from that time, everybody said that he just shrugged it off as if nothing had happened. And then he put in one of the greatest ever performances in a World Cup, and there's a beautiful photo of Pele hugging Bobby Moore. And it was because Pele had later said that that was the strongest rival he'd ever had to face. And so the story goes, Pele had told Bobby Moore after that group game, which Brazil won 1-0, we'll see you in the final, because Brazil considered England to be their greatest rival.
Right. But how did they get on in the end?
Well, they got knocked out in the next round in the quarterfinals. They were 2-0 up against West Germany, and there were some questionable tactical substitutes. And in extra time, West Germany went on to win 3-2.
The kind of common tragedy for English football since 1966, no? And the common enemy as well, West Germany or Germany.
Always with Germany, yeah.
You didn't get knocked out in penalties, though, no? In extra time.
No, not this time. No.
Typical. But yeah, fascinating story. I'll put a link on the text accompanying this podcast to that article if people interested to read the piece. As I said, beautifully written. But we'll take it up to today now, an actual football, and the football that's not happening here in Colombia. As I mentioned in the intro, of course, we should have been gearing up for the Copa America, and Bogotá having big international football matches, which it doesn't tend to get. What it would have been Bogotá, would have been Colombia, Ecuador next week. Was that what was going to kick off the tournament here?
Is that the first game? Yeah. It's in Bogotá. Yeah.
Yeah. So that would have been great. But what is the story? You obviously have your ear to the ground on the local scene here, the club scene. When can we expect domestic football to return?
Nobody knows. There are two huge fights going on within Colombian football. One of them between the league, which is Di Mayor, private entity that is controlled by the 36 clubs, and the government, strangely enough. But particularly with the Ministry of Defence. So Colombia created a new Ministry of Sport. Ministry of Defence, a Ministry of Sport. They created a new Ministry of Sport last year, I think it was, and the minister, who's a former athlete, seems to be doing a pretty good job. He's come out of this smelling quite nicely, compared to most politicians. And he's put his foot down and said, and has been very clear in saying, you're not having football back until we can be sure that this is under control. And right now it's not under control. And so there's been a hell of a lot of pressure put on him. And the league then dragged in Álvaro Uribe, the ex-president, which ruffled quite a few feathers, because this was seen as going above the Ministry of Sport. And he then tried to use his contacts in government to put some pressure on, because the league is desperate to get back up and running. And the background is quite interesting, because at the end of last year, the league decided we're going to have a premium TV channel for all the Colombian league games. And so we're going to shift 5 of the 10 games a week onto this channel, and you've got to pay 30,000 pesos, $10, which is more than you'd be paying more to watch Equidad Jaguares than you would for a month's subscription to Netflix with its entire back catalogue of films and documentaries and all that. So, and there was a debate in Congress, and one of the congressmen tried to put a bill forward to protect football, because this meant removing the 2 games a week that was on public TV, and leaving vast, I'd say 98% of the country without access to watch a football game. And he tried to argue that it was part of Colombia's cultural identity, and so that they should be protected. It should be going out on Colombian TV. And it was rejected by Di Mayor. And Di Mayor said that if you want to show games on TV, then show me the money. Now, it came across as very arrogant back then, but as soon as this crisis kicked off in April, Di Mayor had to come crawling back to the government and asking for a bit of money to help them, and resources and credits and all that. So they've been really, really trying to put some pressure on the government to get this to get the league back up and running. But and only this week, it's changing all the time, but only this week the government have said that if everything goes well, you can return to individual training from June. But even that now is looking increasingly unlikely until the end of the month. Then group training in July, and then we want the league to be restarting in August. Now, the league are trying to squeeze that. They're trying to drag that forward as much as possible. But within Di Major, within the 36 clubs, there's a big, big fight going on between the powerful clubs who are outnumbered on every single vote and the smaller clubs. And this gets all messy, but this is what's going on behind the scenes in this struggle between the 7 or 8 clubs who want a bigger slice of the pie and the smaller clubs that are leading they're trying to get rid of the Di Major president and trying to maintain the present order where every single time there's a vote, they can just outnumber the big teams. The big teams are saying, well, we're being held back because Nacional currently earn the same amount of money from TV rights than Quindío, who have been in the second division for about 5 years. And so it doesn't seem fair, but it's all
quite complicated. I mean, it's like anything in this country; it's never straightforward, is it?
And that's where we get talking about who's going to foot the cost of all the changes that they're going to have to make in the stadiums. Who's going to pay for the testing? Because they're talking about doing 900 tests every single game on all the players and their families. Di Major is saying, oh, well, there are 2 types of tests. There are the quick ones and then the molecular ones. And Di Major are trying to do things on the cheap, of course, whereas the Ministry of Health are trying to get them to do all tests to be the molecular ones. And if they do demand that, Di Major just won't be able to find that money. And it's not clear where they're going to get the money from anyway. And one of the ideas, they're floating a few ideas about, okay, when we do get the league up and running, how are we going to cram in as many games as possible? And they're talking about sending all the teams to the Coffee region. And so playing all games in Pereira, Armenia and Manizales. And getting all the players to stop at hostels and can you imagine, and thinkers and I mean they're still trying to work that out. But there's on one hand you've got Di Major trying to cram in as many games as possible and do everything as on the cheap, and then you've got the Ministry of Sport who almost single-handedly is putting the brakes on this project.
Will we see the league, though, return as it was before this crisis? Or do you think there'll be a few teams that might just have to throw in the towel, so to put it, and go out of business? I'm guessing outside of the big clubs, like you mentioned, Nacional, the 2 big clubs here in Bogotá, Santa Fe and Millonarios, I'm guessing Cali, America de Cali as well, juniors. But outside of those, other clubs, I'd say, are just probably scraping in existence in normal times.
Well, I think the bigger clubs are the ones that are going to struggle the most because there's no chance this year that fans are going to be allowed back into the stadium. And because the TV deal is so bad for the big clubs, they rely on filling their stadiums for the vast majority of their money. And then there's this international TV deal that the president did with a company that wasn't even active. And that money should have been delivered last year. It still hasn't been delivered, and it's $60 million over a period of 10 years. And nobody knows where it is or how they're going to get it. So the big clubs are really, really struggling because they're paying big wages. Now, some of the big clubs like Junior are owned by the Char family, and Nacional have the Lule empire behind them. But the smaller clubs, I mean, half of them are paying their players, especially in the second division, the minimum wage. A lot of them, as a tax fiddle, pay their players. Their contract says they're earning the minimum wage, and they get a lot of the money. The players earn a lot of the money from bonuses. But so they're not really going to be hit that much by this. They're still getting their TV money, and they're not having to pay too much into wages. But already America, who are the current champions, have told their manager, see you later, we're not paying you anymore. They've released a few of their players. the captain, he said, yeah, my contract was ripped up a couple of months ago. I'm not sure if I'm going to be playing anymore. So I think it's the bigger clubs that are going to struggle the most. I've not heard that any club is going to go out of business yet, but I guess it's still a bit early to say, because if Dimajo do get their way and they do manage to somehow get this money from the international TV rights, and they do manage to cram as many games as possible in this year, then we might see that clubs will take a hit, but they might survive.
Okay. I was going to make the observation that playing football behind closed doors, it's a bit eerie, but in fairness, a lot of the lesser known clubs in Colombia, anyway, when they play, it's practically like they're playing behind closed doors. It's only the big clubs that get the supporters, it seems. But you're not a fan of that anyway, though.
Well, as somebody who watches plenty of Colombian second division games live, I'm used to seeing crowds of fewer than 60 people, so it wouldn't make that much of a difference.
Yeah, probably more dogs in the stadium than there are people half the time.
You do joke, but that did once happen to me. There were about 12 stray dogs in a Barranquilla against Real Santander game, and about 2016, then there were fans. So, yeah, this had happened.
Plenty of mascots going around there anyway. But yeah, this whole idea of football behind closed doors, that we've seen it with the Bundesliga in Germany. I mean, it is eerie when you're used to seeing, obviously, stadiums packed out with fans. So that's going to take some getting used to.
Here in Colombia, not so much, because over the years, crowd violence has been a recurrent problem, and clubs are constantly facing fines and bans. And I once saw Nacional win the league title here against Santa Fe in El Campín, and there were no fans in the stadium. Their fans weren't allowed in the stadium, so the Santa Fe fans all left, and they assembled a stage, and the Nacional fans were on the stage lifting the trophy, and there were only a few journalists in the entire stadium. We could hear what they were screaming and shouting. So I think in Colombia it's not too surprising. It wouldn't be too surprising to see that. Certainly in Europe, when you're having Borussia Dortmund averaging 90,000 fans a game, to see there's just cardboard cutouts these days, or sex dolls in South Korea, and it is a big change. But here in Colombia, it's not too big of a change.
And then any word on the continental tournaments, the Copa Libertadores? I guess that's going to be the last thing to return, really.
It is, yeah. And the World Cup qualifiers.
Of course.
Yeah. I bought all my tickets, my flights for that. So yeah, it's looking increasingly likely that they're gonna. So they were meant to be playing the first game in March. Then there were FIFA dates in September, October, November. It's looking increasingly unlikely that they're going to be able to play any of those games, because even if Colombia get their house in order, and when you've got Brazil on your doorstep, and that's worth millions to each federation. Each game is worth millions, so it's a massive loss. And I expect them to do everything humanly possible to make those games go ahead, but I just can't see how they can do. Not in the present situation anyway. It might be different in a month's time, but and the Copa Libertadores, Copa Sudamericana, the same. How can you have? We don't even have international flights until the end of August. Is that right?
Yeah.
So how can you have teams from Brazil and Argentina flying in to play when there aren't any international flights?
I guess the other thing is, of course, some people might think, well, look, football, it's not a matter of life or death, or who was it that said it's more important than that? But there are people who kind of go, it's not the priority right now. But of course, it is very important here for society, as you mentioned. And I also have, there are real lives affected in this. A guy who I had on the podcast, Des Macalinen, who's the goalkeeping coach with La Selección de Colombia. He's back in Ireland now, uncertain as to when they're going to return to training. And even you were telling me yourself now that you're laid off for the moment too. Yeah,
well, I mean, a topic we haven't discussed is women's football and the women's championship, which has been hit harder than the men's game and might never, it will one day, but not for a long time, and will recover, because they were meant to, as part of CONMEBOL, which is the South American Football Federation, sort of equivalent of UEFA, as part of their rules, to compete in the Copa Libertadores, you have to have an active women's team. And so Di Mayor were forced into starting the first women's championship a couple of years ago. And this is also part of their plan to host the 2023 World Cup, Women's World Cup. But it was done completely on the cheap, and only 3 clubs offered their players contracts, and the rest of them were training but weren't earning any money, and we were waiting news of how the league would work. Would it be 3 months like last year? Would it be longer? What format was it going to be? And now they've been left in limbo, and the Players Association have been delivering food to because they're starving. They don't have any money. They've been waiting for this league to start, and then with this huge problem, then they've just been left in limbo. So the women's game, more than any, is going to be affected massively.
Yeah, of course, and always it's almost always an afterthought as well compared to the men's game. So not even an afterthought. They see it as a drain on resources. They don't want to do it because if you look at the people who are in charge of football in Colombia, all of them, I'd say 99. I've not come across my 10 years here dealing with Di Mayor, I've never seen a woman in a position of management within Di Mayor. The 36 club presidents, they're all white men. They're all from the same group of friends. They just see it as a drain on resources. They don't see it as something to invest in. They don't see it as a source of pride. They just see it as an annoyance. And so it's not even an afterthought. It's something that they would love to get rid of, but they're forced into having to deal with. Okay, interesting. And had it or has it been growing, the women's game here on the ground?
Well, the first ever championship, there were 33,000 fans that saw the final. I think it was Santa Fe against Huila in El Campín. 33,000 fans, which at the time was one of the biggest crowds ever seen for a women's game. There are a few factors for that, and Santa Fe were one of the few teams that seriously invested in a proper project and went out and tried to encourage fans to get involved and support their team. They also had the lovely marketing strategy of Santa Fe were the first ever champions of the men's game, and so they wanted to be the first ever champions of the women's game, something they managed to achieve. So there was interest. I don't know outside the big cities whether there would be massive interest, but when Colombian women, the national team play, there's always people watching on TV, and even in corner shops you see that. I don't. Other than the World Cup, I've never seen that in England, and this has sort of emerged from nothing. There's not been any building up of the game over the years, so. There is interest, but it's just never given the resources or the support that it needs.
It's interesting you mentioned that about people watching the women's game here, because the way I see it, I'd be into my rugby and things like that and other sports, but here football is the religion, obviously, and regardless of kind of the level or who's playing it, a lot of the time they'll watch any game, it seems.
Yeah, and they did something with the women's game when they first introduced the league that I'm not really sure what I think about this, but what they would do is play the women's game before the men's game. Now, is that reducing the women's game down to a sort of sideshow, the opening act? It's not being allowed to live on its own merits? Or is it allowing fans to dip the toe in the water and say, we'll turn up, instead of going to the empanada, we'll go to the stadium an hour early and we'll check out the second half of the game. Certainly that's what seemed to happen. I did something with the BBC in that season, and I went down for the women's game, and there were 3,000 fans in El Campín, and quite a few of them were just wandering, and the standard wasn't great, but what do you expect? It's the first ever league. If we were to look back on the first ever men's league in 1948, I think we'd conclude something similar, that this isn't brilliant to watch when you're used to watching European football, especially in this globalised world. But it's something that you've got to invest in and give patience to. And I think there is an appetite for it, but it's got to be nurtured. And as with everything in Colombia, everything's so short-sighted from those at the top. They just want to see the quick buck be made, and women's football doesn't make any money, and that's the biggest problem for the federation, as well as quite a few people, I'm not mentioning names, within Di Major, holding very displeasurable views on women's rights and things like that.
Interesting, a lot mixed in that as well, politics, sexism perhaps, and all that kind of stuff in it. But maybe this is a time for reflection.
I don't even need to avoid mentioning names, because the under-17s physio is currently engaged in a legal battle with the under-17s national team coach, and she's accused him of sexually abusing her, of touching her bottom, of making inappropriate comments, of sending her messages, and this is going through the courts right now. So, and this is one case. Can you imagine what this is like down at a regional level? There must be so many of these cases. This is at a national team level. So, and there have been accusations that the women have been fantastic in organising and coming together and supporting each other through the Players Association, ACO Football, in denouncing these things, and how one of the footballers was in the United States, and she got a phone call saying, we're playing a friendly. She had to pay for all her travel costs, and they had to take a bus from Cúcuta into Venezuela to pay this friendly. Can you imagine James and Falcao getting on a bus and just going into Venezuela without any cost covered at all? It just wouldn't happen. So it's a horrible situation that they're facing, but an important fight that they're engaged in.
Yeah, well, hopefully, I guess talking about it, and as I said, this might be a time for a bit of reflection, although I wouldn't hold my breath that the powers that be are going to make any quick changes. As you said, they're more than likely just thinking about a quick buck and where the money can be made today, but not thinking long term down the line. By the way, Carl, just in these football-less days, how are you surviving for a guy who practically eats, drinks and sleeps football? How are you getting through these lockdown times?
I'm all right, actually, yeah. I mean, the first few weeks I was quite relieved, because I used to have to watch every single game in the Colombian top flight, and I used to watch some of the second division stuff as well, and watch about 60 live games a season, so it was quite a relief. Now I'm getting a bit fidgety. Football Manager, the computer game, has been keeping me occupied, but it's not been too bad. But
I guess you'd be looking forward to, well, first of all, the Premier League will be coming back, and hopefully it should be anyway in the next few weeks. Who do you support, by the way?
Well, I'm not looking forward to that, because I'm an Aston Villa fan, and
all right.
I'm not confident whatsoever that we're going to stay up. So lose that first game, and I wish football will never come back.
Well, you can live in hope. I can understand that from an Irish perspective. I'm from Roscommon, and our football team, well, the perennial underachievers, put it that way, to say the least, in any case. Carl, but anyway, an absolute pleasure. Thanks for that. We covered a lot of bases there, and a pleasure to have you on board. That's Carl Worswick, a football writer based here in Bogotá. If you want to check out that article on Bobby Moore, I will post a link with the text accompanying this podcast. But that is our lot on Wrong Ways Colombia Cast. If you want to get in touch with me, you can via my Twitter handle. That's WWay Corrigan. You can find me on Facebook, Wrong Way Corrigan blog. And Carl, you're on Twitter, yes? If people want to check out your writing and stuff.
Yeah. Let me think. What is it? I'm going to have to check it's C Worswick. Yeah, so WORSWICK.
Wonderful stuff. Okay, until the next time. Ciao, ciao.